Welcome everyone to this new virtual DDD meetup. Today's with me, Marco and me. Marco will be monitoring the chat. And our panel today are Nick, Julie, Michael, and Indu. So it's been a bit of a hectic time. I think everyone feels it now around the world. So I'd like to do a short checking, see how is everybody actually. So I'll start, and then you can pop in, right? And then we go to what we want to talk about, and that's bounded context and translations and everything. So for me, we had yesterday, I'm living in the Netherlands, by the way. We had a half lockdown. It's getting a bit scary. People are what we call hamsteren. I heard Germans also use that word. It's quite a conversation. And nothing to freak out, but it's sinister now that a lot of bars are closing. It's quiet on the street, but it's really nice weather here. So it's a bit eerie, but yeah, on the other hand, I'm doing fine. And I'm looking forward to today, talking about getting some more understanding from these four people about bounded context and translations. So whoever wants to start, pop in and check yourself in.
Okay, I'll start. I actually have been working from home for 30 years, over 30 years, so I'm used to doing that. And I live out in the mountains, in the countryside. I mean, we have neighbors around, but I don't live in a city or even the suburbs, right? So it doesn't look or feel much different around me than it normally does. Although, so I live in Vermont in the US, and our state is also now, like, schools are closed for at least 3 weeks. In our main city, our biggest city, Burlington, they've shut everything down. So it's kind of weird. But for me, I'm not seeing it, right? It doesn't feel different for me. So, but it started feeling real yesterday when one of our friends said, he's been diagnosed with COVID and is in his room, our mutual friend. And he was rightfully scared. So hopefully he's looking for comedies on Netflix to watch. So that was good, but it really elevated, I think, how I've been feeling about it. So, but other than that, so mentally I'm okay. Physically, I'm fine. I'm actually just getting over having had the flu for a couple of weeks, but just flu, I'm pretty sure. That's it.
Yeah, so I'll keep on. Live in Nuremberg in the city center, one of the, not the biggest cities in Germany, but some of the bigger ones. We're basically on a lockdown right now. There's just a few sorts of shops that are allowed to be open. The rest has to be closed, like gyms or something like that. Yeah, so for me, actually, I planned on 2.5 weeks of home office work to work on some stuff. So currently everything is going according to plan for me, but let's see how it goes. Yeah, my aunt caught this virus as well. And yeah, let's see how it goes.
Hey, I'm Indu. I live in Murrieta, Southern California. It's a bit surreal. Schools are closed, and I'm trying to tell my teenage kids that this is not a school holiday for you to go hang out, watch movies, and do things with friends. So they're trying to get adjusted to that, and it's gotten a little bit more personal. The more I know about people I know who I know have gotten this, so it's a bit difficult. And yesterday, going grocery shopping was just one of my worst experiences, where I couldn't find milk, couldn't find bread, eggs. So it's a bit weird that people think that this is the end of the world and go buy toilet paper. By the way, that was also out. So like it's just so weird to see like so many aisles just empty, not in just one grocery store. I was looking for bread and I had to go to 2 stores, and there was like one small piece of bread that I was able to find, but it was all empty. So it just feels like we're living in different times. I do work from home. I have been working from home for the past 8 years. But what's weird is like I'm not used to my kids being home all the time. I'm just used to my dog being at home with me. So it's also like a disruption of like what I would like normally work and stuff. I just want to get through, I guess, the next couple of months in a good way, and things get back to normal. I miss our normal. The last fun I had was hanging out with everybody I know at DDD Europe, and the next thing I know is like I can't find bread or milk. It's that's kind of how I feel at the moment. Sorry, not painting a very cheery picture, but one thing that I am appreciative of is this whole virtual environment, and being able to continue to learn and you know, spread knowledge and still do things, good things together.
So I'm Nick, I live near London, and over the past few days, I've been eating Nutella out of a jar. And I'm not ashamed of it. It's been a real joyful moment to just take a spoon and dip it in the Nutella jar and just eat it from the spoon. It's like, if the world's ending, I can do anything I want to.
I do that on a normal day.
That's kind of balancing things at the moment. I think on one side, there's the real scare factor, like how badly could the situation get? And on the other side, we've got people doing all kinds of crazy things to keep themselves entertained and make people laugh. And it's like, yeah, I'm just fluctuating between this is scary and this is crazy. And then in between, I've got bits of Nutella. In terms of work, it's been a bit awkward with work, actually. I had a couple of good clients lined up, some workshops, some conferences, and pretty much cancelled all of that stuff now. But I'm lucky that I still can do some work remotely. I had my first French lesson online today. That was kind of okay until the connection got really bad. And then it's like, I'm listening to French over a bad connection. It still sounds the same. So that's about as much, yeah, that's the top of my head. That's my check-in. Thank you for having me here. I don't know what I'm going to say tonight.
Marco?
Yeah, well, I don't want to carry on this gloom and doom. I mean, we all feel the same thing. Everybody who's self-employed or a consultant feels the lack of contracts now, and conferences get canceled left and right. But I think we as a community have a great opportunity to actually build up more experience with online tools, with virtualddd.com and other virtual communities. And I think this is not only going to improve the situation at the moment, but I think the experience we gain now in these next few weeks might help the society to become less dependent on co-location in the future, I hope. And I hope that we get toilet paper and food soon back. That would be great.
What is toilet paper? People keep talking about
I don't know what people are doing, but
talking about.
let's not talk about toilet paper today.
What is
We're here
toilet
for
paper?
something different.
So basically, what I always do when I start my workshop is do this check-in. There's these things in the air, and I thought today let's start the virtual DDD like this. See if it's getting a bit more personal, right? Get that out, what hopefully is hanging here. So yeah, so shall we continue and start with the subject of today? So I'm not sure when it was again, January 16, Julie Lerman had a topic, help you understand the nuance between anti-corruption layers as translation between bounded context and between bounded context and bounded context. So to explain what your tweet was about, because I think so many characters cannot fully translate what you want, right?
Right,
so Julie,
right.
Can you?
So I was doing a workshop with a client, and part of the workshop, while I was there, we had a kind of company-wide, anybody could attend, where I did a presentation on introduction to domain-driven design, just really, really high level, you know, strategic, tactical, from a talk that I have. And it's kind of like a part 1 and part 2, because usually when I do this talk, it's to developers. So I do just a little bit on strategic, and then I, you know, give them high level of tactical, but then get into some of the key points of tactical. And you know, and I think anti-corruption layers is a part of that. I'm not drilling in too much, but just that's one of the high level topics that I'm giving them in this part 2. And I've done it enough that this last time, that same day, I got to that slide and I realized that it was really limiting, right? Because the more I understand, you know, the more and more I understand domain-driven design, you know, I realized that anti-corruption layers are just a small part of the way we communicate between the systems or subsystems. And that, you know, I realized maybe, you know, anti-corruption layers are just one of the ways. And I realized I was really missing that nuance, right? Because when I first started learning or understanding anti-corruption layers, I was more focused on, it's a way for a bounded context to communicate with a legacy system or communicate with another bounded context. And as I'm working with clients, you know, and we're like, okay, we need to have a message queue to make this connection. We need to have something that's more of a translator for this connection. And I just realized I didn't have the language to differentiate all of those things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of gray area. I think there are a couple of patterns, but if you said to someone, here's 2 code bases, which one's an anti-corruption layer and which one isn't, there's no strictly defined definition of this one clearly is and this one clearly isn't. It's very much of a, if there's a lot of translation, it is, and if there's a bit of translation, it's not. What's a lot and what's a bit? Yeah, it's not a precise.
Yeah. So I thought, if I'm stuck on this, there's got to be a lot of people who don't realize that they're limiting themselves. So, you know, I think we need a bigger kind of umbrella term for communicating outside, you know, of a bounded context, either whether it's incoming or outgoing, and to create some guidance around what is good for certain situations. Obviously, the guidance isn't strict, right? It's just to get you kind of in the right path, or on the right train tracks, since you've got the train behind you.
What's the rules on speaking? Do I have to put my hand up or something, or do I just speak, or do I just jostle my way in?
You can just talk whenever you feel like it.
Okay,
And
so
if it goes haywire, when it goes off track, we'll get you on track again.
Cool. Could go off track very quickly. I'm on track at the moment, but keep an eye on the train. It might. So the point I wanted to make here is, I find enterprise integration patterns is a useful starting point whenever I have any of these discussions. You know, it's basically, I think nearly all of the scenarios you come across in terms of messaging systems, it's got most things covered. What I would say is the enterprise integration patterns are I would call them like the lowest possible level building blocks. And sometimes what we see is clusterings of those patterns. Like you might, we have an incoming payload, we split it, and then we route it. So a combination of these patterns, these enterprise integration patterns, is probably more at the level of DDD. It's a combination of those things. Like, I came across a situation a few years ago working in an IoT system. I wrote a blog post about this, and I used some of the enterprise integration patterns. So the terminology they use, if something sits on the edge of your system and it's responsible for the messages coming in or going out, the definition here is a gateway. This is called a gateway. So if you have a translator which sits on the edge of your system, it's a gateway. And a particular example I saw is that it was a gateway which took a large payload. It split the payload up into individual pieces of data, and it routed those messages to the bounded contexts that, that were responsible for owning each piece of data. And then I called it a gateway interchange context because Eric Evans talks about a pattern called an interchange context, which is about translating languages. And I felt this gateway interchange didn't really have any logic in there. All it was doing was translating the external format to the internal format and doing a bit of routing. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So Alexei raised his hand and I invited him. So Alexei, welcome to the chat.
Yeah, hello there. Long time no see, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Julie. I haven't seen you for a while. Everyone I met recently, but not you. At least virtually. Just want to say something about, I agree with Nick that a lot of patterns for integration are actually basically, but ACLs, anti-corruption layer, would say is a matter of integration. It doesn't only go be between bound contexts, it also can be between different aggregates for that reason, right? So like aggregates don't talk to each other, so you have something in between that talks to them or integrates, transfers data from one aggregate to another. And in addition to those things, we have mentioned in the AP book, we have things like process managers, routing slips, classic messaging sagas. But I found that in event sourcing, I'm sorry to talk about event sourcing again. In event source systems, the most prominent version of ACL is basically some sort of read model that one bound context build up upon the data coming from another bound context. Of course, integration messages, what we call external messages, just replicate things on the side that they can just go to and fetch for the sake of checking stuff and understanding what's going on in another place. So I think you, Marco, talked about this when we discussed, or at least tried to touch the legacy system stuff, DDD and event sourcing legacy systems. I think it was kind of ACL thing for the, like we do anti-corruption from the legacy.
Seems like you're talking about the implementation side of bounded context then there, right?
Not necessarily. Sometimes it's like, it doesn't matter where your boundaries are for me. Like if it's a context boundary, of course it matters linguistically and on the conceptual level. But even the slightest boundary, an aggregate boundary, would require some degree of integration. And of course, the anti-corruption layer don't live inside the bound context because they share the same language. I think that may be the biggest difference between translation and integration in general and the anti-corruption layer, because anti-corruption layer prevents you from being corrupted, right? And if you have, for example, conformist relationship, then you don't have any anti-corruption because you basically conform. If you have partnership, you also don't have anti-corruption. So you really need to have something really kind of alien to your domain language, something completely different. And I think maybe in legacy systems, it might be the case. At least that's what I feel.
Yeah, thank you.
thanks. So, question to you, Indu. I've seen your last talk at the conferences about resilience patterns. So, in relation with what we just discussed and what Alexei and Nick just said, towards an anti-corruption layer in your talk.
So for me, like messaging has always.
What's your perception?
Can you hear me? Okay. So, sorry about all the background noise. So I think that like one of the things that I've struggled a little bit is like messaging gives me that resilience. Communicating between different services via messaging gives the reliability or resilience. But one thing that I've struggled in the past is I've always used events as a mechanism to communicate between bounded contexts. So a bounded context would publish an event and the other one receives the event. That is kind of an integration. But the thing there is like, I used to think of them as public events and private events. So bounded context publishes events, and when it's consumed by things on the other side, then I consider it public. Public because you need to put thought into what goes into the schema of those events, and because it has a lasting impact. So if you make changes to the schema, and all of a sudden you're impacting all those on the receiving side. And so it starts to become a little confusing about like who owns this message. I used to think of a very simplistic way of if you are the context that's publishing this event, then you own it. But then it's like it has an impact on a whole lot of other bounded contexts. So that's kind of where when Eric talked about, and Nick mentioned here about the interchange context that Eric had mentioned in one of the keynotes, started to make more sense. It's no longer a simple concept of something owning the event. This sort of language and also the schema and everything what goes in the event needs to be agreed upon. We need to have like a conversation. You can't just go in and change this event because you're affecting a whole bunch of downstream subscribers. All the goodness that you've gotten with messaging is lost, like all the reliability if you end up breaking a bunch of subscribers. So you're supposed to be loosely coupled, but you end up still breaking. So the idea of the interchange context and having a way where like all of these context owners can have conversations about this is what these events need to be, gives that like I think upfront, like it's no longer about like one team. When you put this as this is an integration thing, and therefore we need to have a discussion with the owners of like these are about bounded context. You kind of bring in multiple players into account. So then like whatever you design as schema will tend to be better. And by not breaking your services, when you upgrade, like, your services are reliable as well. So for me, that's kind of like where the interchange context and resilience and these things for me fit in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does to me. It does, and I myself also relate to what Eric published really long time ago. I think getting started with DDD when surrounded by legacy system. I think it was 2013. It's still posted on his site, and he talks about this messaging and anti-corruption layer and where it fits. And well, that also reminds me of your talk at DDD Europe, Michael. You talked a lot about context mapping and how to visualize this, right? Care to, your mic's still muted, but care to show your perception on it?
Yeah, I did that talk. I did a summary about context maps and how we can visualize contact between bounded contexts at DDD Europe. And one of the takeaways for me while getting or reading into all these things, working with clients, is that I think basically context maps help us to visualize and to talk about various perspectives of contexts between bounded contexts. I would say let's pick up the messaging discussion. That's one way of looking at things, how those contexts communicate. One option, which is obviously a very preferred option nowadays for very valid reasons, is obviously event-based messaging. Yeah, but we still have synchronous orchestrated messaging with RESTful HTTP resources, with SOAP web services, especially when we talk about legacy environments. They are still out there. And I mean, there were some good reasons, for instance, to build them, maybe. Yeah, who knows? I mean, they're out there. We need to deal with them. But I don't think that these perspectives, they are protocols for me. Yeah, and I don't think that they are of a high degree of a relevance when I talk about an anti-corruption layer, because another perspective is, for instance, something like model propagation. How do models, how does language of bounded contexts propagate into other bounded contexts? So for instance, if you take a look at the conformist, there's a higher degree of propagation of those things, a higher depth of coupling to those things than an anti-corruption layer. Also the shared kernel as an even stronger way of propagating and coupling. And we also have some organizational perspectives on the contexts, on the contact points between bounded contexts. Let's just take a look at customer supplier. That's, I think, the impact on the model. Yeah, there may be some, but I think customer supply is a highly organizational pattern. The same goes basically for the partnership, where two teams coordinate their efforts and they talk a lot about, and they coordinate testing. And what I used to do in the last couple of years is separate those discussions. And for me, for instance, the anti-corruption layer is something where I think, how does a model propagate any further? And I think we also need to take good care about this translation. What kind of a translation do we have there? Do we just have a translation from a technical model coming from some web service stubs or whatever to our own internal model, which on the other hand preserves a lot of the outside language? I would have a hard time arguing that this may be a bounded context. I think anti-corruption layer, I think for me also a language translation on the ubiquitous language level is a very important characteristic of this thing here as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. So we have a question from Sean W122. I like the YouTube names. He says there's always some coupling going on. How much should we be concerned with downstream services when making changes? So I think that's a pretty generic question, because he says services. I'm not sure if he means services or contexts here. Let's assume he's talking about context and not just technical services. But what does it depend on? How much do you concern yourself with the changes you make concerning downstream services or
It
contexts?
sounds like what Indu was talking about. So maybe reiterate some of that with respect to the question.
Yeah. I think that like one thing that we can do right off the bat is like, make changes in a way that you are backwards compatible with your whoever is the listener of these events. So for example, don't change existing schema. If anything, like add a little, add detail, or like add something new for the new subscribers in a manner that you don't break the existing subscribers. or listeners of this event in the other contexts. So that's one thing that you can consider. But the other thing is, like, before we start adding things in this event, if we have a conversation with the owners of the other bounded context, if we can decide, we can be upfront about what goes into the information. Like, try to be conscious about not adding too much stuff in the event, because every time you add something, I tend to think of it as, what do you want to consciously leak out of this bounded context? Leak is a bad term. So we want to be like, think about, like, you know, what do you want to give away from this bounded context? So the less you do, the more you are protected against change. So I hope that helps answer some of that question.
May I pitch in here as well a bit?
Sure.
I think it also highly depends on the, I would say, on the organizational environment you're in when answering that question. I mean, what's the agreed governance here? I mean, if you are a very strong upstream system with a lot of power, I mean, you can push your changes into an organization as a team and without worrying too much about the downstream systems. I mean, there are organizations that do that. On the other hand, you have organizations where downstream teams have a lot of vetoing power. If an upstream team wants to do changes, there's always someone, oh, we don't have the time, we don't have the budget. I sometimes call that the vetoing customer and the helpless supplier pattern then. Yeah, and it's an anti-pattern kind of thing for the customer supplier thing. And I think we should also take good care about governance culture in those things as well. So in which kind of an environment are you on a political level as well when answering those questions?
Yeah, and I think with this, we go into what Nick, you talk a lot about, is like the social technical part, right? We can solve a lot with consumer-driven contracts, perhaps, or settling everything out in tools. But mapping, for me, in a context map, mapping the social relationship is, for me, really important, because, and I'm not sure how you do this with your customers or where you work. Whenever I explain that and I say, well, for me, it's always protect my bounded context and see where my relationships are with the rest of the bounded context. Based on that relationship, I make a decision how I will implement my bounded context. Right. So if I can't tell anything about what they do, I might just do a conformist relationship and I'd be fine with it. But this gets people a lot in confusion during my workshops. I'm not sure how you see it. Bringing in that social part, right? I never giving a clear silver bullet here, but yeah, depending on your relationship with the others, map it out, and based on that, create your implementation. So do you have the same pattern I see a lot in your organizations?
Can I go off on a hand-wavy tangent here? Is that allowed? It's loosely related to the topic. So yeah, one of the problems I found, one of the problems I've had, one I still see a lot, is that people are scared of changing contracts because they don't know who's actually using this thing. Like, until you start doing techniques like event storming and people are realizing, oh wow, another team's using that event. I had no idea they were using that. And I'm kind of embarrassed for the industry that we have all of this information as code and systems in software, and we can't work out who is consuming this thing I'm producing. And that adds lots of uncertainty. And I think we need to get to a stage where we know who is using what. And actually, that's one of the things I've found was quite appealing about GraphQL, because the front end makes a query and requests specific fields. And so the team there knows which fields are being used by the consumers of this. So if you want to deprecate a field, you have the insights about what's being used there. Like you might have a message being used by 10 different consumers, but one of the fields you want to deprecate isn't being used. So why go through all of the effort of worrying about who might break and spending lots of time worrying if no one's actually using it?
So do you use it as a conversation starter to ask people if they actually wanted to know those fields, or if they just have them in the query because they didn't get rid of the old code?
Not sure. I'm not sure what
I mean,
what you mean there, sorry.
Yeah, so when you said you see as a backend service, you see when people ask for specific fields with GraphQL, let's assume they asked a question, but they don't really need it anymore. It's just, it has been written in the past and used in the past, but then the front end changes its behavior, but nobody refactored the old query. So from a backend perspective, you would still assume that's a necessary field and you would still provide it. So there is no actual dialogue happening. How do you ensure that kind of dialogue happening between both?
So I guess it's all hypothetical at the moment, but those front-end developers, they're pretty passionate about performance, and if they don't need a field, if they can reduce the size of that payload, they'll get rid of stuff. So we can never be 100% they're not using it, but you would think with the goal of making the front end faster, there's an incentive there to not use things you don't need, and that provides more feedback.
Okay, thank you.
But I think in the future, there are no limits really to having this visibility across systems about what data is being used where. I think if we only think about the constraints of the way we build systems now, we might not realize that 10 or 20 years from now, the intelligence of the systems we build, the amount of metadata in the system that we can use to understand how the system works at runtime, how it changes over time, and how we can use that for the design. I think that's going to be an exciting evolution.
So one thing to move on there, right? Because you say we can see it from data. It reminds me of 12 years ago where I still was using IBM MQ as event-driven architecture, which was fun. Don't do it. But we had a monitor visualizing our whole event-driven system. We visualized on the screen where the events go, and based on what the business wanted, and here domain events come into place, we could monitor actually what we expect to happen during the day, sort of. So it could trigger us to see what happens, but it really helped us because we could clearly see what our ups and downstreams were. And I think, and it doesn't even show in architecture, but also in continuous delivery or in a lot of other subjects, I think we just don't monitor enough. It always gets backtracked or sidetracked. However, it gives you so much domain knowledge to actually get that part in, right? That's how I see it. I'm not sure if you witness the same, of monitoring getting a bit lower on the we need this skill.
One thing I've seen recently related to, so first of all, I would say there are some companies out there who do tracing and they can see messages flowing in their system. It's not everyone who's not doing this. And there are companies I speak to now who are building platforms, and as part of the definition for a service, you have to specify your dependencies. So the industry definitely is moving in that direction, where the system you build contain more metadata. And something interesting I saw, was it last week or maybe the week before, the last DD London meetup, we had Ben Rucker, who was talking about his workflow orchestration system using BPM. Everyone likes BPMN. I'm converted. And he's blurred the lines between a BPM system and a message broker. It's like the BPM system contains the business workflow, but it doesn't contain logic in there. You don't build your app in there, you just define your workflow in there. And so I feel that this visualization of dependencies and schemas can be defined in this kind of workflow tool, but building each of the individual contexts, teams can still have their autonomy. So I feel like this way of visualizing dependencies is an area for improvement, but there are already tools there.
I think Bernd is doing some really interesting stuff here. I absolutely agree with you, Nick. One thing that I always tell my customers when they go for, I would say, highly distributed architectures with independent teams is to tell them to think about what is their microarchitecture, which is freedom for the teams where they can make decisions. But what about the macro architecture, which is about the system as a whole? And one part of that is always stuff like tracing. Yeah, please have a common ground on tracing. How do you do tracing? What do the teams need to inject into their payload, into the headers or something like that, so that you can set up a sophisticated system for tracing where you can actually get sort of a live view, what is happening, who is talking to whom, who is consuming what, and so on. Because when you document those things up front, and when you do a requirement for you need to document what you consume, I always see the risk that it gets forgotten, it gets outdated, and so on. And I actually prefer live data from a running system.
I just want to add to what you were saying, Michael. Like, one of the things that we do in End Service Bus, the way we implement it is like all the messages are getting processed. So the successfully processed messages, we look at the headers. So we're able to understand like who sent the message, you know, how long it took, etc. But we're also able to build tools on top that give you the visualization of the message flow in terms of a sequence diagram or a message conversation diagram, basically built on top of information from those headers, like a correlation ID. So there may be a correlation ID that's important that ties like, you know, 5 of these messages together. But by having a visualization of like, this is what, you know, from when this message happened, it touched these processes in this way, to kind of have a visual picture, and have that be live, right? Like not some document that someone wrote, but actually this is how your system behaves. I think that's like one of the like powerful aspects. And like when I first read Gregor Hoppe's paper on like, you know, programming as a call stack, or I forget the actual title of his paper, but it was on event-driven architecture. He talks about like, you know, it's event-driven architecture is great, but we need to have the sort of tracing and visualization of like what is going on in your system as a whole. And that's also why I'm so interested in this interchange context, because if this is sort of the space where you go and you look at your system and go, oh, yes, I have a process, which is a cascading of events from here, here, here. But if you can see that in one place, it just makes it a whole lot easier for the person that's like implementing the integration, or to even see how change propagates.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, Julie, we started with your question, right? And how is your first question now evolving? We were discussing on Twitter quickly about live brainstorming about all aspects of translations. Are we getting there?
Yeah, and there's so many pieces that are coming together. It was I wonder if this conversation, I'm just looking at notes I've been taking about interchange context, aligns with scenarios where we're thinking about building some kind of a, you know, translator that's doing some processing in order to do the translation, and clients actually say, you know, we start asking, is this a context? Is this another bounded context? So when you're talking about an interchange context, Indu, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, it's what Eric had mentioned, and from what I understood, it's the sort of space in between all this bounded context, which kind of is interesting, especially for the communication of how communication happens between bounded contexts, as a way to have clear language and have a way of clear understanding of how this integration happens. So that's my understanding, and like oftentimes, like for me, why this makes sense is like you know, in an event-driven world, like a business process can be constituted of different events that happen in different contexts. So there's like no one place that you can go and look and say, hey, that customer loyalty program, what's that process? There is no, like, you'd have to look at the events from this context and that context to get that clear picture. So, so that's kind of where if we have this space that says like, these are the events or these are the messages that define this business process. And for me, that's kind of what I think an interchange context is.
So,
I would be interested in, who do you think should own the interchange context? So I've seen only one interchange context in the wild, actually, in my own production, and that got its own owner and its own life after a while. So it became another big ball of mud and kind of a problem. So if you have two contexts who need an interchange context in between, who should own it? Who maintains it? How do you deal with that?
Before we answer that, Marco, can I pop over a visualization of this interchange context the way Eric does it?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So let me share my screen. Correct one, I hope. There we go.
Expecting Kenny to start knocking the screen. Is anyone in there?
So do you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the first one, interchange context that Eric talks about in his article. Is this the way you relate to it as well when you talk about it? So this one is without its own data. So he talks about several strategies of moving away from a legacy, right?
This is the bubble context.
Strategy. And then he says, this is the bubble context. He goes into autonomous bubble.
Yeah, I think we lost Kenny.
The interchange context.
Yeah, it seems like what happens with me when I try to share screen and have my camera streaming.
Yeah. So to me, this seems to be like the anti-corruption layer, but not an interchange context that he's presenting here.
And, you know, I think this is really the source of what was my confusion, which is that when I was learning about domain-driven design, anti-corruption layer was a little hard for me at first. And I almost stopped thinking as much about all those other things around the context map, all those other possibilities of the context map. And because I wanted to share this hard concept, right, that ACL was kind of a hard concept for me, especially because I could never remember anti-corruption layer. I could always remember ACL. So somehow I just kind of focused on that. And by focusing on that, then that became the only tool I had in a context map, right? I lost the others. And so what this is doing is bringing me back to seeing all those other possibilities as not just in, you know, the map from the book, but also all these new ideas and new information too.
Can I just give a shout out to Valadis, who left the comment, who killed Kenny?
He's back.
Yeah, I'm back. Hi. Yeah. Did you see where did you Where did I jump?
You were
did you
scrolling around
lose me?
the visualization and talking about bubble context.
Could I quickly say one thing about ACLs while we're on the topic?
Yeah.
So I've written some blog posts over the past few years talking about these kind of strategic patterns. And the patterns I've talked about are often very different. And there's always at least one person who says to me, either on Twitter or the DVD Slack or some other channel, that's just an anti-corruption layer. Like everything I do, that's just an anti-corruption layer.
Right. That's the problem. Because anti-corruption layer is one of the pieces in the puzzle, one of the options we have.
Well, I think the term anti-corruption layer, because it involves some translation, whenever you talk about anything that involves any translation, someone's going to say to you, that's just an anti-corruption layer.
But is it really about any translation? Yeah, that's. I think that's a very interesting question here.
Yes.
When I translate from one technical model to another technical model, but I stick to the same language and I have the ubiquitous language of one team sneaking into the domain model of my bounded context, is that still an anti-corruption layer?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so either. Yeah?
But if you write a blog post about it, someone will say to you, that's just an anti-corruption layer.
Definitely, yeah, for sure.
Yes, so we have
This is the
Christine.
problem that I'm trying to address and see if there's a way to explain. You know, I think maybe I was coming from the perspective of I'm trying to help people understand, just get their first understanding of domain-driven design, right? So what do we do with this? How do we make sure people are learning this bigger picture instead of always leaning on, we're translating from one thing to another thing, and ACL is a translator, and therefore everything's an ACL, right?
Yeah,
That's where we're getting stuck.
I think that defining an ACL is a translator is true, but that doesn't mean the other way around. A translator doesn't have to be an ACL. That's just one way.
So
and anti-corruption layer has a high benefit that you protect yourself from corruption by another context, but it's a high-level concept, as Rebecca just wrote. But it also has a downside of you diverge culture because you put a barrier in between two parties. Both teams will evolve in different ways. They stop communicating because you are protecting yourself from someone else through a thick wall. And all the other translation layers have also trade-offs, but are in most cases much more beneficial than anti-corruption layer. Anti-corruption is, to me, the most extreme way of protecting myself from a hostile outside force that is either malicious or that I have no control over. And most relationships aren't like that. Most relationships have some kind of leverage or some kind of collaboration built in. And if it's not, then anti-corruption layer is a good pattern, but it should never be the go-to pattern to start with because it has a huge downside.
So I always like to reread Eric there, Marco, and I think you explained it quite well. On his website, Domain Language, he has the reference book, right? You can buy it also. Let me phrase what he says. He says, translation layers can be simple, even elegant, when bridging well-designed bounded contexts with cooperative teams. But when control or communication is not adequate to pull off a shared kernel, partner, or customer-supplier relationship, translation become more complex. The translator layer takes on a more defensive tone. And that's what you were talking about, right? So as a downstream client, therefore create an isolated layer to provide your system with functionality of the upstream system in terms of your own domain model. This layer talks to the other system through its existing interface, requiring little or no modification of the other system. Internally, the layer translates in one or both directions as necessary between the two models. So that's the official pattern, the way Eric Evans explains it. And I think that's what we talked about, right? It's protecting your own bounded context because else it becomes more complex, the translation.
But where do you draw the boundary between that definitely is protecting and that definitely isn't protecting?
Well, that's a good question.
And you've got different kinds of systems. You've got the event-driven stuff, the synchronous communication stuff.
Yeah, I think the dialogue about that is more valuable than a pure definition. So starting the dialogue of, are we having an anti-corruption layer or not, and should we have it or not? That dialogue is important.
I think
also another thing on the other end of the spectrum in terms of the patterns, if we look at the conformist, what is a conformist? When I talk to a lot of customers and teams, there is a very strong perception that the conformist is seen as something like a total anti-pattern. And I personally don't see it that way. Yeah, I think there are very good reasons for being a conformist as well. Yeah, so I always like to discuss those two patterns together in order to make a clearer distinction between the two.
I like
so
Michael's been doing, where he's been taking the patterns and he's been analyzing the different characteristics of them, like the model propagation, the social relationship. And I think if we're going to have a useful definition of anti-corruption layers going forward, we're going to need to have a more detailed analysis of the different kinds of translation, the different reasons for translation. And then we can have, I think, something useful. Like, I think it was reasonable that when Eric wrote the book, he gave this high-level definition and not a million different examples of the concept. But now we have 16 years of building DDD systems. It's time to start refining the concept and looking for specializations of the pattern variations. If we want the word to be useful in a specific way.
Yep. So
I agree with you.
You know, at DDD heuristics, part of the virtual DDD, we started the heuristics page. Is there something we can create as a strategic pattern topic where we can just create these new, maybe start with heuristics, not patterns, but just heuristics? We created this specific translation because of this and this and this. Would that be a day to collect them there?
I think that would be a really great idea, to be honest, because what I see, especially within the company that I'm working at, we had really hard discussions how to interpret some of those patterns, how to draw clear definitions, boundaries, and lines around them. And I think a very good approach for that would be to approach that from the heuristic side. I think that
Also,
would be
maybe
a good idea.
combine that with a decision tree.
Yeah.
Like a workflow decision tree, but together, right? Because we need descriptions and all of that, but also just something more high level to help guide people through those kinds of decisions, not to be you know, the rule, but just guidance to help people get started thinking about where to go.
Yeah.
And that's what Rebecca says. Yeah, a decision trees are good to figure out what decision questions to ask. And we're trying to do this now. There's a lot of event storming heuristics, and I'm trying to set it up for the event storming heuristics, right? A decision tree.
So there's a question from Valadis asking Kenny specifically, what is a heuristic? Can you define it? Is it a it depends pattern or a guideline?
Should we bring in Rebecca if she wants? I think she still is the one who explains it the best. Are you okay with that, Rebecca? Let's see if she replies.
Christine has given us a good example of a heuristic. I don't agree with Marco. That's a good heuristic.
That is a good heuristic. Yeah. I would always go with that.
Most of the time you'll be right if you've got to go with that heuristic.
Yeah, so the way I explain it is we are, and it's based on what Rebecca says, right? It's a rule of thumb. So it's anything that has a plausible aid or direction in the solution of a problem, but in the final analysis isn't justified. So I just recently posted my key heuristic. Well, now it's better than ever, probably. It's when I get a sore throat, my wife comes in and she gives me this ginger, cooked ginger with lemongrass. And she says, drink this. well, at that point, it might actually solve my stomach throat, but it can be a virus, right? So it doesn't maybe solve it in the end, but it can already help me, because if I really want to analyze that, I need to go to the doctor, need to make an appointment. It will cost a few days, and maybe in 2 weeks I really find out what it is. But maybe it was just a sore throat, and the ginger tea helped. But maybe actually it was, yeah, right now you have corona coming in, and then it wouldn't help. But that's longer, right? So
You
it wouldn't hurt
had
me to
to
do it
wrap it
now.
up with Corona.
Yeah, sorry. It is it is evident now to show you that heuristic might potentially be fallible, and so that was a good example, perhaps.
So,
So
Matthias,
in a way, when you go to ddheuristics.com, you can find 3 sorts of heuristics. So you first have design heuristics. So align with business values, one of yours, right, Nick? So how do we want to align bounded context? As we align with the value stream, for instance, or with the business value. They have things that guide heuristics, which are, okay, I used it to help guide the way we create heuristics. And the value-based heuristics are, my prime value-based heuristic is everyone's correct and nobody has the monopoly to the truth. So I hope I made really quickly sense of what it is. And yeah, when we're in complex adaptive systems, you want to start. You cannot overanalyze, so you need some guidance based on past history, experience, and their heuristics will come in handy.
I think all of this will be great, because for somebody maybe looking at the mind map, the DDD mind map in the book, right? And you've got the context map, and then all of these possibilities, ACLs and different possibilities in there, having some guidance around that. I know, they read the book and read this and read that, and watch the session and everything, but I really like the idea of adding to that with something more high level, and heuristics and decision tree and all of that. I like that.
Yeah. So we should get started on that.
I already have a handful of heuristics, I think, for conformist. And I'm not sure, I think share kernel as well in my DDD Europe slide deck, which is on speaker deck. Well, I can pop some in. Kenny, you're muted.
Kenny, you're mute. We can't hear you.
Aha. So I say just go to the website, and there's this submit heuristics, and it will explain how. It's really simple. I did one today, and it took me like 5 or 10 minutes to just create one. And as soon as you start doing it more, start getting easier. Yeah.
We'll do that. We'll put that on my to-do list.
Is that the right link, Michael?
Exactly.
That I put on there?
That's the one.
Socio-techno. Okay, great.
Yeah. And Marco will save these chats, because someone killed Kenny during this chat, so I lost all the chat. And we'll publish it with the YouTube channel. So does this make for a conclusion right now, or is there anything, any more questions, Marco, popping up? Needs to be.
Nope, all questions have been answered so far. And there was a very lively chat going on in Zoom, which is still going on, I think. So we'll leave it on for a few minutes.
Yeah, great. And one thing that was still on my mind, I recently did a workshop with Rebecca, and you said it, Nick, because you read the Enterprise Integration Pattern book, right? Which is, well, how long? Way back?
I think it's an early 2000s book, right? Around about 2000, 2003.
And we kind of seem, in this industry, we kind of seem to lose all the valuable information that got, there it is, that got written down by all these great people. And I'm reading back a lot of them. And I think if we just start there, and now I'm going to answer my own question that I want to I want to ask you the same, is what can people do tomorrow to get more into this? Well, I would say read one of these books from way back, right? The enterprise integration pattern book is still useful. Maybe it needs a bit updating, but it's still useful there. It helped you, Nick, right? So I think let's start with there. And now to wrap up, I want to ask you, what's your prime heuristic to start with tomorrow? So what's your prime tip to people? What can they change tomorrow?
Who are you asking? Me?
Everyone. Doesn't matter. Pop in.
Yeah, so I would continue your theme then. I would say, look at a situation you're feeling at work, when you've got this conversation of translation you're trying to deal with. Analyze the different components, the different systems that talk to each other and the responsibilities they have, and try to describe this pattern using the building blocks in enterprise integration patterns like the splitter and the router and the translator. Try and describe your pattern using these building blocks, and then think of a name for it. Try and describe it using a descriptive name.
Great.
For me, I'm so interested in helping other people get these ideas and understand these concepts. So I think for me, it would be, maybe even just a blog post around, hey, there's more than just ACLs, right? Like it's not all ACLs. And here, just point people to resources to understand that, and point out that, that thing that I stopped seeing, which was, the context map has many ways of introducing communication between it, in and out of bounded context, not just between bounded contexts. So if that's important for me, just that really high level, like, hey, you just start by knowing this, and then you can start really learning some of these other things. And that's where I would be. That would be my heuristic. If that's a heuristic. I mean, solving the problem that I have, right? These other people have the same problem. Nick's expressed the same problem, that a lot of people just say everything is an ACL. That's it for me.
Thank you.
I want to second what Nick mentioned about enterprise integration patterns. That's one of the books that got me going when I first started looking at event-driven architecture and like how do I do this? And a lot of the times, like what goes on in real life, like pub sub. I mean, like real life patterns can be ascribed as software patterns, like pub sub is one of them, and the routing slip or the itinerary pattern is another one. So there are like a lot of patterns in there that the book describes that could be like used to see what makes most sense in this type of integration. So that book has over 100 or 120 or more so patterns, and but it's really a good book, and it's by Gregor Hoppe and Bobby W, I think, if I remember right. So to me, that book was like, and I think the book also states like I think it starts with like why you can't use database as a queue, or like having a table, and it kind of like breaks it apart into like why is this thing needed, and then goes on to describe all the different patterns. So I found the book really useful. Yeah, 100 or so patterns. Thank you.
Thank you.
The thing I would like to quickly say about the EIP patterns is that they are very technically focused. They don't talk about domain concepts like core, supporting, and generic. So I don't want to give the impression that the EIP patterns alone are sufficient. I think they're the technical building blocks, and you add DDD concepts on top of that. Like I said, core, supporting, and generic. Mm-hmm. And look at your situation from the technical, the domain, the core, supporting, generic perspective, that the pattern encompasses all of those things.
I think that's a very good introduction to my heuristic stuff, which I wanted to mention is also take a look I know Nick and Indu were mentioning this amazing book for a very good reason. So there is a lot of wisdom and knowledge in there, but I think those are very technical patterns, and we also need to make sure in which kind of an environment do we apply those patterns. What about the governance of an organization? What about the culture, the politics that play around in an organization? For instance, do I want a generic subdomain to be, or let's say it other, do I want a bounded context from a core subdomain to be a conformist against something in a generic subdomain? And also think about those kinds of things, how they have an impact on, I would say, communication dynamics between teams, and also reflect that when making those decisions. I think you can really mess up your life if you don't look at those things.
You should start writing a book on enterprise communication patterns, just for in between teams, not technology.
Yeah, it would be very interesting. I mean, the team topologies folks, they touched upon that a little bit. I mean, this could be pulled a little bit further without a problem, I think.
Yeah, so I started writing a blog post actually, where I try and capture all of these things, like every single aspect of integration between two things or two or more things, from the technical, the socio-technical, the main perspective, business perspectives. I think I've got like probably 50 bullet points on there, like 50 different degrees of freedom on that, or characteristics.
Yeah.
But not a whole book. Who's writing the book? You're writing the book, Marco.
I'm not writing a book. Oh, forget it.
Julie has a name for the book.
Yeah.
I forgot it already. I have to scroll up. Human communication patterns for enterprise. There you go.
Oh.
Oh,
Hippie or not? Human integration pattern.
hippie.
Never mind.
Hey, that works
Yeah,
for
hippie.
me. I'm a Vermont hippie.
Or hype. It's actually hype.
No.
So, I think Marco, do you want to do your heuristic, or did you already do it? I lost track.
I don't know. I don't have a heuristic to add at the moment. So for me, I actually have a heuristic. For me, the most important heuristic to have the conversation that reflects the nature between two bounded contexts in real life. So if you feel that you have an anti-corruption or a need for anti-corruption, or that you have some kind of pairwise relationship or whatever in any detail, having the conversation between the people in those respective contexts is more important than any technical definition. And by that conversation, you might get to the actual relationship. If you have a facilitator that is a little bit on the empathic side, they feel, oh yeah, we misjudged, and you can see the real nature of relationship by looking at how the people behave and who is in the room and who wouldn't come to the meeting and all those things, which has a lot of organizational issues, but that's my go-to heuristic. Always start with a conversation and the rest follows.
See, you did have a heuristic.
So I wrote a blog post about this. I called it Organizational Dysfunctions Mirrored as Architectural Complexity.
Yeah, I know. I have a confession to make.
Guess what?
Almost all of my wisdom comes from Nick Tune's blog. So
guess what?
That's your real key heuristic.
Hey, hang on. Guess what someone said to me about that blog post?
it's just an anti-corruption layer.
Just anti-corruption.
It's just so there we go. It's just an anti-corruption layer.
Well, let's say, Nick, your blog is just an anti-corruption layer protecting you from all the people who think it's just an anti-corruption layer.
Cool. Well, I hope this answers most questions for now. Probably there's a million more questions at the moment, but I think it was a great start. So thank you, everyone. Thank you from around the world joining our VDD session. Thank you to our panelists. And one thing, you might have already seen Twitter coming by, but it's real. It's coming at you. And I need to remember again, it was 14th of May. We will have a DDD, which means Distributed Domain-Driven Design Day. It will all be virtual. We're going to have panel discussions like this. There's a session ice popping up, but there is also some online collaborative modeling, what we want to do, some Q&A recorded talks, the way Julie Lerman describes it. There's a session ice link. We'll post it on our Twitter, and please submit if you have ideas. It will be free for everyone to join, just like this session. So thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you at the next session, which will be pretty soon, I hope. We got, in a few weeks, we hope we get some new one in. And we're going to podcast this tomorrow, and have a great evening. And everyone, hopefully stay safe. And until next time, thank you for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you.